This is Duke University.
It is truly a pleasure to introduce a scholar whose work and friendship have inspired me for more than a decade. Alondra Nelson is professor of sociology and director of the Institute for Research on Women and Gender at Columbia University. She is a tremendously accomplished, internationally recognized scholar with work ranging from the cultural study of race science and medicine to gender technology and social and political movements. The author of Body and Soul, The Black Panther Party and the Fight Against Medical Discrimination, and the forthcoming Social Life of DNA, Race and Reconciliation After the Genome, she is as well co-editor of Technicolor, Race, Technology, and Everyday Life, and Genetics in the Unsettled Past, The Collision of DNA, Race, and History, and also the editor of Afrofuturism, a special issue of Social Text. So you see the vast range that is also evident in the many numerous essays she has authored, ranging from genomics and justice to new media and digital culture. From her earliest work, Professor Nelson has shown herself to be a deeply thoughtful cultural analyst who invariably brings a discerning eye to the role of science and technology in contemporary U.S. culture. Professor Nelson has distinguished herself for her intellectual judiciousness and critical acumen, but also, and this is no small feat in her fields, for her diplomacy, which is especially important for her scholarship, because I didn't think I was being witty, but I'm really glad. Ara really outdid me. I could not possibly compete with that. Which is especially important for her scholarship because of the highly controversial nature of the areas in which she works. She has earned the respect and trust of the communities about which she writes because she combines, better than anyone I know, sensitivity and intelligence. Diplomacy for her does not mean avoiding difficult subjects. Rather, she approaches the most difficult questions with an open mind and an enviable ability to listen. I think that's actually our most important trait as teachers and writers. Over the years, I have seen her negotiate delicate subjects with grace and precision. It is not surprising that she has won numerous awards for her work, including for Body and Soul, the Mira Komarovsky Book Award of the Eastern Sociological Society, a Distinguished Contribution to Scholarship Award from the Race, Gender, and Class section of the American Sociological Association, the Association for Humanist Sociology Book Award, the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Award from the Association of Black Women Historians, the Just Wellness Award from the Third Root Community Health Center, and she was a finalist for the C. Wright Mills Award. That's just for one book. And then teaching awards and all kinds of things. The intelligence and judiciousness I have mentioned is evident in Body and Soul, which focuses on a largely de-emphasized aspect of the Black Panther Party program, a serious and committed health activism. Building on recent scholarship in African American studies that unearths continuities between the civil rights and Black Power movements, Professor Nelson challenges conventional histories of the Black Panther Party to show how its health politics was central to that continuity. The book also makes an important methodological contribution, showing how attention to health activism as a form of analysis changes familiar historical narratives and historiographical methods. Contending that the Black Panthers were themselves theorists as well as social justice activists, Professor Nelson shows how new analyses of the relationship between health and politics actually changed health explanations, such as the persistence of sickle cell anemia in Black populations, and therefore health outcomes. The Black Panther Party's commitment to health initiatives, that is, shows practice not only emerging from, but also constituting and perpetuating a form of theory. The Social Life of DNA manifests the same broad command of her topic and multiple theoretical contexts, but shows her impressive range by offering an ethnographic study of a contemporary phenomenon, the explosive interest in African American genealogy sites that use DNA to track the genetic roots of African Americans. This phenomenon has been extremely controversial among scholars of race and genetics, not least of all because of the questionable accuracy of the test results and the lack of sufficient regulation of the businesses offering this service, and of counseling services to help people interpret and understand the implications of the results of these tests. I've seen Professor Nelson present this research numerous times in a variety of contexts, and I've been deeply impressed every time by the compassion that infuses but does not temper her analyses, as she offers a comprehensive and nuanced analysis of the history and contemporary function of the impact of genetic research on African American genealogy movements. Professor Nelson is one of the foremost analysts of the relationship of race and genetics in the contemporary U.S. and has written extensively on the complicated ways in which scientists, policymakers, and individuals understand and make use of the information circulating as a result of developments in the study of genetics, leading up to and stemming from the Human Genome Project. I find it always a pleasure to read and reread her work, and of course to listen to her presentations. I will not keep you longer from that pleasure, so please join me now in welcoming Alondra Nelson to Duke.
Thank you so much. I'm terribly embarrassed. Thank you, Priscilla. That's very kind. So good morning, and Priscilla has really traveled the journey of writing this book, and which I'll gloss for you today for the last decade, and so she'll be terribly bored. I mean, I think there's nothing I could possibly say that she hasn't heard already. So it's an honor because she's been such an important interlocutor for me in finishing this book to be able to have an introduction for her. I wanted to thank Professor Khanna for having me today and for the invitation to be here, and also the Program in Women's Studies for establishing and fostering such an important conversation space, and also to thank Kim Carlisle, Letitia Farrell, and also Layla and Jackie, who've been incredible in helping us just get around and just be here. They're quite extraordinary. So before I begin, I want to, do a kind of Sunday church thing and set our intention for the morning. And I want to do so by talking a little bit about a text or quoting from a text that's perhaps the most important feminist text for me as a way to start the day. And I want to borrow from some powerful words from the Combahee River Collective Statement of 1977. This is a quote. "We've been involved in the process of defining and clarifying our politics, while at the same time doing political work within our own group and in coalition with other progressive organizations and movements. We are actively committed to struggling against racial, sexual, heterosexual, and class oppression, and see as our particular task the development of integrated analysis and practice based upon the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking. Our politics evolve from a healthy love for ourselves, our sisters, and our community, which allows us to continue our struggle and work. Focusing upon our own oppression is embodied in the concept of identity politics. We believe that the most profound and potentially most radical politics come directly out of our own identity, as opposed to working to end somebody else's oppression," close quote. So I wanted to read these particular sections of the Combahee River Collective in part because I want us to understand that the term identity politics, the etymology of it in part comes from this statement, and that when we sort of cast away or toss aside lazy criticisms of identity politics, we're actually doing a lot of violence to Black political struggle and feminist struggle in American society. And I want to remember that next time we hear somebody say, "Oh, identity politics is over." I mean, it's very much in the tradition of feminist standpoint politics, and I want to honor that. Okay, so this morning I'm going to discuss how and why insights and inferences from genetic science are being applied to U.S. racial politics, particularly African American cultural practices aimed at social repair and restitution, broadly conceived. I will discuss several activities initiated mostly by U.S. Blacks who embark upon journeys to discover information about their ancestral origins with the aid of a genetic inference, and who in turn propel this information into a plethora of socio-political uses. Reflecting more than the faddishness of all things genealogical today, although there's plenty of that here, I argue that these endeavors illustrate how overconfidence in genetics has been annexed on to long-standing, unresolved, and therefore persistent debates about American belonging. On the one hand, these efforts show how novel applications of genetic science may offer new avenues for social inclusion or exclusion. On the other hand, these efforts reveal the stakes of the misplaced hope that scientific knowledge that scientific knowledge that is being used to stratify our human community into stubborn hierarchies of value, racial and otherwise, can confirm identity, guarantee recompense, or engender justice. When I began this research about a decade ago, I spent time with root seekers and genetic genealogists. I initially set out to understand the extent to which race was being reconfigured from a social and political category to a biological one in the late 20th and early 20th century. Through these interactions, I came to see that we social analysts of race and genetics may in fact cede too much explanatory power to the science, and that other motivations are at play and are powerful in how genetic ancestry inference is taken up. My work with genetic genealogists also revealed concerns about racial reification. While these concerns were well warranted and necessary, my work suggested that they did not begin to do justice to the myriad purposes to which DNA identification was being put. I began to see that there was an unwitting genetic determinism to our feminist, anti-racist science studies. For example, the fact that the Human Genome Project that confirmed the overwhelming genetic similarity of human beings and then swiftly gave way to researchers' obsession with difference is a central contradiction that serves as a starting point for most of our work on race and genetics, I think begs questioning. The idea that the human genome gets decoded and a new racial regime ensues, I think is too pat an explanation for the dynamics that I've uncovered, and also a too pat an explanation for any of us who study systems of inequality in US society. So a temporal consideration followed from this conceptual one. The decoding of the draft of the human genome in 2000 was actually the midpoint of an already evolving politics of race and science, not its inception. Thus, the after the genome phrase in my talk title is not the summer of 2000 when President Bill Clinton held a bilateral press conference with British Prime Minister Tony Blair to announce this scientific feat. Rather, we need to look back at least a decade or more to the conditions that precipitated the Human Genome Project, just as much as we look to its reception and completion. So what I'm trying to suggest is that our approach to the social study of genetics and science has been the equivalent of studying the civil rights movement, beginning with the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or of studying the AIDS epidemic with the introduction of antiretrovirals. This temporal shift is critically important because, as sociologist Jenny Reardon has documented in her book Race to the Finish, the details of the rise and fall, which details the rise and fall of a plan beginning in 91 to sample and archive the world's human genetic diversity by gathering the DNA of, quote, isolated populations, that the broader work of the Human Genome Project was always vexed, even a decade before its draft was complete, by racial politics, racism, and biopolitics. The larger political backdrop of the time is also important to consider. After all, the Human Genome Project was conceptualized in the late 1980s, during the term of a Reagan presidential administration that began its first term by declaring war on affirmative action. In Reagan's first months, an aide from the Civil Rights Division of his Justice Department would fan the flames of reverse racism, saying, quote, we really make a mistake to try to cure discrimination with discrimination, close quote. Soon after, President Reagan would famously say, echoing sentiment that would ring throughout his two terms, that, quote, we must not allow the noble concept of equal opportunity to be distorted into federal guidelines or quotas, which require race, ethnicity, or sex, rather than ability and qualifications, to be the principal factor in hiring or education, close quote. Thus, the emergence of this new genetic science was being developed in a specific political moment as a form of racial ideology that Eduardo Bonilla Silva and others have termed colorblind racism was coming into strength. Although it has become commonplace to discuss the Human Genome Project as a signal achievement of the Clinton presidency, it was as much a vestige of the Reagan regime. And keep in mind that Reagan was swept into office on the wings of denunciations of a phantom welfare queen and with rhetoric that was blaming the undeserving poor and the victim as the vacillating pole, right? A kind of racist and sexist vacillating pole with colorblindness. These are sort of the spectrum of the Reagan presidency. And this is Linda Taylor in the 1970s, the notorious so-called welfare queen. Moreover, this Reaganite shift in racial discourse diminished some of the potency of earlier political tactics. So the Reagan presidency oversaw the adoption of mandatory minimum sentencing laws and the so-called war on drugs, accelerating the largest expansion of mass incarceration the world has ever known. Reagan also drove the stigmatization of activism, and I'm thinking here of the air traffic controller strike of 1981, which effectively begins a process in which activism is outlawed such that To go to a protest today in a place like New York City, I went to, last spring I went to a silent march against stop and frisk. Someone had to go down to City Hall, register, tell the administration where we were going to march and when we were going to march and such. And recall also that Reagan had begun to develop this strategy in the late 1960s as California's law and order governor. And thus, by the end of the 20th century, race was becoming, quoting Dorothy Roberts, more significant at the molecular level, precisely as some declared it to be less significant in society. This is from her book, Fatal Invention, close quote. So what room for political struggle remains? What type of tactics or political activism remain in such a context? Dorothy Roberts, again, offers an answer when she quotes in her book, Fatal Invention, quote, "Even some activists who oppose racism have adopted the view that race-based genetics and technology can be used as a tool," close quote. What we might call genetic politics is not, however, a politics like any other. There are properties unique to DNA that make it uniquely deemed suitable for both truth claims and also available simultaneously for claims about the individual and the collective. So anti-racist actors using genetics as political leverage, as I talk about in my book, are not necessarily guilty of self-delusion. Rather, they find in DNA a tactic to advance some issues important to them in a post-Reagan, post-Clinton political climate and a time after the genome and its longue durée that is increasingly chilly to demands for social equality and racial justice. As sociologist Stephanie Greenlee, a student of mine, contends, extending Bonilla Silva and Howard Wyman's and others' conclusions about colorblind racial ideology into the realm of political action, and she does a case study of the Gina 6 mobilization and social media and that. Today's social justice movement, she writes, quote, "must now attend to their tasks in a context where erasures and silences on racism threaten to render the very basis of complaint invisible," close quote. In short, combating colorblind racism requires first the restoration of color vision, the return to visibility of both historic oppression and contemporary inequality. It requires new insight. As I will describe in this post-racial, post-genomic moment, genetic analysis offers the unique and somewhat paradoxical possibility of magnifying issues of inequality literally and figuratively at a microscopic level and bringing them into view. And after this social awareness is raised, inequities can be framed and attacked using more traditional strategies such as the courts and social movements. So why turn to DNA for leverage in racial politics, given the fraught history of scientific racism? One answer is because this may be a small window of opportunity in a political terrain grown hostile to demands for social justice. Thus, rejecting outright a reductive, essentialist understanding of race as a genetic fact does not and perhaps should not preclude exploration of the way in which DNA analysis contributes to racial politics. Indeed, we need to keep open our curiosity about the new techniques and tools that are being used for the politics of a digital and genomic age if we are truly to understand what's transpiring. And to be clear, I'm not making a normative claim. I am not describing what biopolitics should be after the genome. Rather, I am trying to understand what they are. The use of DNA analysis has become widespread, and diverse aspirations, interests, and ends are now sought through it. In addition to its diagnostic, forensic, and genealogical uses, genetics is increasingly called upon to arbitrate social and political issues. The logics of DNA analysis, the centrality of the prism of heritability, to use Troy Duster's phrase, the privileging of molecular scale, the use of statistical methods and probabilistic algorithms alongside biobanks and genetic databases are moving across and beyond their characteristic domains of biomedicine and forensic science into practices of self-fashioning, kin-keeping, and family formation, among other sites. The double helix has wound its way into the nucleus of some of the most significant issues confronting American society. And DNA is being used today, applied today in what I call reconciliation projects, genetic endeavors aimed at variously ameliorating the injurious repercussions of the past. With reconciliation projects, DNA analysis is incorporated in attempts to reunite formerly opposed parties or formerly unified ones, rejoining broken ties within a family, a community, a nation state, or a diaspora, to uncover biographical or historical information that has been lost to the march of time, or to adjudicate contentious issues. These efforts to repair damage caused by fractious social and political struggles are undertaken in many arenas, including courts of law, laboratories, NGOs, and museums. While reconciliation signals the poignant public hearings, in post-apartheid South Africa or in Greensboro, and elsewhere, in which individuals bore witness to the traumas of racism or other rending of the social contract, for my purposes, reconciliation projects are in line with such initiatives, with similar initiatives, but necessarily also include a forensic mechanism for getting at the truth of the past. So although reconciliation projects may include reparations politics or campaigns for state apologies, these are distinct types of social action. And DNA is a critical component for me of reconciliation projects because it's imagined both as the technique and the remedy. The aspirations of reconciliation projects are a broad spectrum of social action, and the anticipated outcomes span broadly. And indeed, these projects may not have a practical or legal endpoint, as I'll gesture to later, or their endpoint may be unspecified. Therefore, the inauguration of a reconciliation project in and of itself may warrant our attention. So my book, The Social Life of DNA, details 4 what I call interrelated genetic dramas in which DNA is employed to allay or resolve some contentious issue. And the time I have remaining, I want to gloss a little of the detail of the book for you and show you how DNA analysis has become pressed into the service of resolving unsettled socio-political issues with both success and failure. In 1991, archaeologists uncovered several graves on a plot in Lower Manhattan. These burials were discovered in the course of the completion of a land survey conducted by a commercial archaeology company on behalf of the U.S. General Service Administration, or GSA. The GSA, the federal agency tasked with the oversight of logistics of governance, from office supplies to real estate, planned to construct an office tower at the location that would house government bureaus. The unearthed burials confirm that the planned construction site was also the location of the Negroes Burial Ground, or Negroes Burying Ground, it was also called, a former municipal cemetery for the city's enslaved African population. The rediscovery of this colonial area burial ground, with its promise of rare insight into the life and death of Bond's people in New York City, was an occurrence of great historical import. Following exhumation, the contents of the grave sites were brought to the Lehman College laboratory in New York City for further investigation, where the method of analysis consisted primarily of osteology, the scientific measurement of skeletal remains, and the broad classification of them into several categories, including stature, age, sex, and race. This forensic approach was and remains standard practice among many physical anthropologists and was the perspective that the Lehman researchers brought to their research project. Other anthropologists, however, including those at Howard University who would become involved with the African Burial Ground Project, found this forensic mode of analysis and interpretation inadequate to the historical significance of the cemetery. Detractors of the Lehman approach, including Michael Blakey, pictured here, an African-American biological anthropologist, would soon become the burial ground's new project director, contended that the Lehman College approach was unduly preoccupied with the gross racial classification of the sort that was employed for criminal justice purposes. He further maintained that this methodology reduced the individuals in the burials to narrow typologies and thinly descriptive variables, thereby disassociating them from their particular culture or history. Many local activists felt similarly. A group who referred to themselves as the descendants of the African Burial Ground, right, which is a kind of political identification because there's obviously, very unlikely to be actual kinship between these people. So the descendants of the African Burial Ground expressed their opposition to any forensic analysis of the remains that would yield classification of them solely by skin color. The activists argued that such an interpretation amounted to the quote-unquote biological racing of their ancestors' remains. The community pushed for interpretive approaches that would generate more than racial classification of the skeletons. Criticism of the biological racing of the remains also suggested clarion awareness on the part of both the activists and the scholars about the historic use of biometrics, that is, the use of scientific techniques to measure and analyze human bodies, and the use of this information to bolster scientific racism, and thus the potential for flatly descriptive work to yield racialist interpretations of the burials. For as Stephen Jay Gould and numerous others have documented, the comparative mismeasurement of bodies, from lung capacity to crania to genes, with white bodies serving as a norm against which all others are measured, white male bodies moreover, has long been employed to advance deliberate and erroneous claims about Black inferiority. Against this backdrop of the bitter legacy of racist biological research, supporters of the Howard University's analytic method of interpretation sought to upend this history by using biometrics alongside other forms of scientific and humanistic analysis to glean new information about the embodied experience of slavery, as well as about the particular African origins of some of the earliest Black Americans. Indeed, for the self-named descendant community, the rediscovery of the African burial ground represented a stirring possibility, a retreat from designation by skin color alone and the stigmatizing concept of race for both their ancestors and themselves. These are just some images of the remains. So what do I want to say here? So these are some of the activists pictured here, and they did kind of spiritual ceremonies. So part of the concern was not only about the analysis, but also about the souls of the people who were buried there. So there were often evening vigils in which spiritual ceremonies were carried out. And the African burial ground politics also became involved in sort of, kind of racial ethnic politics in New York City. So here's the New York Senator David Paterson, who would become the governor of the state, David Dinkins. So it was very much a kind of early 20th century ethnic politics, but with African Americans. And this is Queen Mother Delois Murphy, I think is their surname, pictured here. So it was very much a kind of interaction of electoral politics and Black kind of nationalist and cultural politics. So the eventual siting of the African burial ground research at Howard University's Montague Lab, a historically Black university, partly in response to pressure from the local community, therefore marked not only a new temporary home for the remains while they were being analyzed, so they were moved from Lehman College, but moreover, a fundamental change in the framing of how and why the research was conducted. If the question undergirding the investigations of the Lehman College lab in New York City could be summarized as, are these the bones of Blacks? The Howard researchers, to the contrary, sought answers to a more extensive set of questions, including, quote, and this is from their research proposal, what are the origins of the population? What was their physical quality of life? And what can the site reveal about the biological and cultural transition from African to African American identities, close quote. And posing these questions about the remains, the research team at Howard hoped to use the rediscovery of these rare remnants of Black colonial life as an opportunity to more fully detail knowledge about how those buried at an African cemetery in Lower Manhattan lived and died. At the Howard Lab, in other words, the research orientation was shifted from an epistemology of racial classification to an epistemology of ethnicity and ancestry. Analysis of these remains was thus broadened to include a panoply of social and historical interpretation that might render, quote, biological evidence of the geographical and microethnic affiliations, quote, close quote, of enslaved Africans in colonial New York. The historian Michael Gomez argues that Africans brought to the Americas as slaves during the Middle Passage underwent, quote, a transition from a socially stratified, ethnically based identity directly tied to a specific land to an identity predicated on the concept of race, close quote. In the process, he eloquently observes that they had, again, quote, exchanged their country marks. In other words, their myriad ethnicities for a generic collective racial category or caste. Race would, in subsequent years, become a master status for African Americans, our most defining social category. Some analysts debate the similarities and differences between race and ethnicity, distinguishing them as respective research orientations, and I distinguish them as the respective research orientations of the Lehman Laboratory and the Howard Laboratory. And in doing so, I follow some sociologists' understanding that these categories are analytically distinct. Building on the work of Herbert Gans, sociologist Mary Waters has demonstrated how ethnic identity has shown how ethnic identity can involve a good deal of volition and vacillation rather than being a hard set biological or primordial category. And moreover, the historian Werner Sollers has been more avid calling ethnicity an invention. Yet this choice and this flexibility, these ethnic options, as Water terms them, have historically been available primarily to whites in the US. As she writes, quote, Black Americans are highly constrained to identify as Blacks without other options available to them, even when they believe or know that their forebears included many non-Blacks, close quote. So the opening up of ethnic options for African Americans that the African burial ground research potentially represented was as rare an occurrence as the rediscovery of this historic cemetery. The scientific authority of forensic analysis carried out by the Howard University team offered the hope of tipping the scale of Black identity from tight ascription to slight volition. and walking a fine line in which they contested biological racing of the remains, yet advocated for the use of similar techniques toward the construction of a fuller understanding of the slave past, the activists and Howard researchers engaged in a quest for the reversal of the racialization produced by slavery, if not its enduring effects. That is, they sought to restore pre-enslavement identity to the individuals interred in the burial ground, and the distinction between the descriptive and analytical approaches to interpretation, between biological racing and the restoration of specific details of African origins, was the backdrop for a novel interpretation of scientific analysis and, moreover, genetic analysis that would be borne out eventually in genetic ancestry testing. So the Blakey team did not use race as the sole category of analysis, and it used mixed methods. It employed a broad range of analytic groupings, and they also used what they were calling at the time molecular genetic assessment, or DNA analysis, in order to ascertain the possible regional and ethnic origins of the cemetery population using relatively new methods to infer human genetic diversity. This is in the late 1980s. Early 1990s. Of particular interest to the researchers was the expectation in 1992 that there were clear distinctions between the genetic identities of social groups. Thus, although the Howard team opposed biological racing through osteology, they were open to thinking about it on a clinal basis, that is, from a perspective that considered genetic variation across a broad spectrum. But the Howard researchers also held out the hope that there was potential for determining the ancestries of the African burial ground populations as well. So, in 1998, George Washington University graduate student Rick Kittles, who was not an original member of the African burial ground research team, but had participated in the study from 95 to 99, embarked on a new wave of genetic analysis of the remains from the site that would prove much more successful than that of his colleagues, and in time make important contributions to the use of DNA analysis to infer the ethnicity and origins of the burials. So they would do genetic analysis in two waves, using a subsample of the close to 400 individuals, the burials that were found before the excavation was shut down. So there's three waves, and they're not very successful because you're dealing with ancient DNA techniques that were weren't well developed in the early 1990s. So in the first wave, there's 9 individuals analyzed, and the second wave, there's 7 individuals, and then in the third wave, there are 48 samples that they're able to get samples from and amplify such that they can do some analysis with them. So it was Rick Kittles, the graduate student, as our graduate students do for us, who brought the sort of cutting edge technique to the project. So in order to examine the data, Kittles needed to solve 2 problems. First, ancient DNA sequences are fragile and short in length, and he would need to find a way to manipulate the short sequences that were available to him without destroying them. And in order to interpret these sequences for ancestry with any measure of accuracy, he would need a substantial comparative reference database. To solve the first problem, Kittles turned to technologies that allowed for the analysis of characteristic genetic markers in Y chromosome DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Using a method that has since become commonplace, he compared DNA from individuals found at the African burial ground with that of contemporary Africans. There remained the issue of the database. Since the few existing reference databases containing this information were not large enough to make reliable inferences about where in Africa buried individuals might have come from before arriving in New York, he began to compile such a database on his own, using publicly available tissue lines from commercial companies such as the Coriell Institute, a US biobank established in the early 1960s that is now a primary repository for tens of thousands of DNA samples, as well as contributing samples he had obtained through his own research or that had been shared with him by colleagues, about which I can say more. Using these techniques, Kittles hypothesized that the macroethnic affiliations of the burials he examined were from Western and Central Africa, with specific findings for some of the remaining coming from Benin, particularly the Fulbe people, Niger, the Hausa people, Nigeria, the Fulani, and Senegal, the Mandinka. The Howard University study formally concluded, let me just see what slide, so this is just more about the findings that he made. Formally concluded in the fall of 2003 with the ritual reinterment of the remains of the 419 individuals whose graves had been excavated. This included the commemoration of their lives and of the scores of others, estimated between 50 and 20,000 in total at the cemetery, who had remained buried in the 6.6-acre lot. A.O. Harrington, chairman of the group called Friends of the African Burial Ground, and others envisioned that the significant site would be commemorated with a museum of African history that would also contain a DNA bank. Those are her words, collected from burial remains and then stored at Howard University. that could be used to help subsequent descendants, quote unquote, determine their origins. Harrington said, quote, "If we could find one person who could one day go to that DNA bank and it was determined that that person was a descendant, although we all are, it would just be something that folks would celebrate around the entire globe," close quote. Even Michael Blakey, who was the senior researcher on this project pictured here, who was Kittle's mentor turned critic, articulated this potential for DNA analysis in 1998. The scientific research now underway constitutes yet another dimension of a longstanding human rights struggle for African Americans. We seek to restore knowledge of African American origins, identities that were deliberately obscured in the effort to dehumanize Africans as slaves, close quote. So in brief, I do more about this in the book, but in brief, the linking of DNA to human rights of course, has been claims that were made in other types of projects, right? So I'm thinking about geneticist Mary Claire King, who worked with the mothers of the May Plaza and post-junta Argentina and employed mitochondrial DNA analysis to return the children and grandchildren of disappeared activists to their family. And the anthropologist Lindsay Smith describes this ongoing endeavor in Argentina as, quote, "the first worldwide to organize around genetic technologies as tools for human rights." So there's lots of these projects going on, and I want to understand the struggle over the African burial ground as part of this larger global political struggle. The African Burial Ground project facilitated the formation of, he then criticized Kittle. So Kittle leaves the African Burial Ground project and starts the African Ancestry Company, a commercial company using the techniques that he develops on the African Burial Ground project. And in the New York Times, Michael Blakey says the following: "It is a questionable matter that a former researcher should take part of our program currently in development and do what he is doing, inherently, creating a commercial industry." So the African Burial Ground Project facilitated the formation of African Ancestry, Inc., one of the earliest genetic ancestry testing companies in the US. More to the point, the company was partly erected from the genetic studies on the Lower Manhattan gravesite remains when Kittles converted these techniques from a research enterprise into a business one. Although studies of ancient genes have been conducted since the late 1980s, beginning with Brian Sykes and colleagues' important Nature paper demonstrating the ability to amplify DNA obtained from bone, in addition to the Jefferson Hemmings case, which was in 1998. The African Burial Ground Project was among the first and most public uses of these techniques in the US. Commercial genetic analysis is typically and aptly regarded as an offshoot of the Human Genome Project. However, an origin story for genetic testing that begins with supercomputing or single nucleotide polymorphisms can only partly account for why this analysis has become widely popular, and moreover, why it's become important in African American cultural politics. The controversy that transpired over excavation methods and research priorities at the burial ground, on the other hand, reveal how genetic information would come to be seen as the building blocks for reconciliation projects related both to the history of chattel slavery and the future of American racial politics. So this supplementary genealogy, one might say, for genetic ancestry testing elucidates why and how this form of DNA analysis took a particular course towards social and political utility, and why claims of racial essentialism brought against the consumers of genetic genealogy testing may actually somewhat miss the mark. So I will just sort of skip over. I can answer particular questions about how the tests work if you're interested, but I include some of this in the paper that I sent around, so perhaps you have a general sense of how the tests work. So African Ancestry's MatriClan and PatriClan test kits are promoted as a means to uncover details about the experiences of enslaved blacks, to redeem and restore today's stigmatized African American family by reuniting it with an ancient, idyllic African one, to cement affiliations among members of a transnational network of black elites, and to resolve the social injury inflicted by the peculiar institution. In all of these enterprises, which I trace in the book, Rick Kittle's role as a scientific entrepreneur come cultural advocate is as crucial as the genetic tests themselves. As I have described elsewhere, novel selves and collectivities may be fashioned from these tests. These new tests are paradoxically anchored in the past, and although the pursuit of roots is animated by individual yearnings, given the always communal nature of genetic information, these results also scale up to the heteronormative notion of the family and up again to a heteronormative notion of African diaspora. Genealogists actively fashion these new identities from the genetic cloth supplied by the African Ancestry Company. They strategically shape their genetic results into usable paths that open up new avenues for contemporary social interaction, including travel and civic engagement. The formation of these DNA diasporas or DNA networks is illustrated by a project spearheaded by the Leon Sullivan Foundation, an organization with deep roots in the civil rights movement. The Sullivan Foundation is a nonprofit that is named for an influential African-American Baptist preacher and activist, Philadelphia-based, who for decades before his death in 2001 was a crusader for racial equality. So he's pictured in the tall gentleman in the dark suit, and he's pictured there. That's Leon Sullivan, the late pastor, next to Martin Luther King Jr. Sullivan was a zealous promoter of African diasporic cooperation and mutual aid, and he was granted eventually, before he died, mostly titular citizenship in Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, and the Gambia in recognition of his efforts. DNA diaspora networks are efforts to foster reunion and collaboration among a transnational group of Blacks through philanthropy, economic development ventures, dual citizenship schemes, and heritage tourism. African ancestry's DNA testing is frequently the basis of affiliation for these networks that are forged between continental Africans and US Blacks. These initiatives resemble Back to Africa and Pan-Africanist enterprises of the past, but importantly, they point as well to a possible future of genetically derived global racial politics. Beginning in 1991, the Leon Sullivan Foundation inaugurated these biennial gatherings, which they call Leon Sullivan Summits, that were gatherings of elites from across the US and the African continent, and they consisted of dialogues between politicians, bureaucrats, and business leaders. And prominent American attendees to past summits included George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, who was an honorary chairman of the board of the Leon Sullivan Foundation, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, the Reverend Jesse Jackson, as well as business leaders such as Paul Wolfowitz, the former World Bank head. The 8th summit meeting, which took place in Arusha, Tanzania. So I just want to show, so Sullivan, before he died, wrote 2 memoirs, and he had a kind of messianic prophetic vision to, as this says in the bottom there, to make a link to build a bridge. So part of his mission as a pastor was to draw these links between Africa and the US, and you'll see here the logo of the organization just has, it's the world with 2 land masses, a continent and the US, right? So that really drives home the point, okay? So they have started having these biennial meetings, and they want to effectively, just quoting here, encourage the development and use of effective DNA testing methods to identify specific linkages to African ethnic groups among members of the diaspora to enable informed choices about national affiliation. So in 2008, they hold their 8th summit in Arusha, Tanzania, and it marked a turning point for the organization because on this occasion, the diasporic connection that Sullivan had always talked about, this bridge, this link, and had been for decades fostered kind of through the imagination of a transnational community, was then became soldered with selected biological ties. At the close of this 8th summit, the participants, which included the African-American actor and genetic genealogist Isaiah Washington, about who I'll say a little bit more, approved a resolution to formally recommend that US Blacks purchase DNA testing from African ancestry. So this is just the website from the 8th summit, and you can see African Ancestry's logo at the bottom there. So it's a collaboration with Rick Kittle's company. These roof seekers would then be encouraged, but not required, to embark upon philanthropy and economic development projects in the countries to which they were genetically matched. Isaiah Washington, who learned of his matrilineal affiliation with the Mende community of Sierra Leone in 2005 using African Ancestry Service, would in 2010 become one of the small number of US citizens to be granted dual citizenship in that country and would become the first person ever to do so based on genetic genealogy, although his fame had something to do with that as well, of course. So I'm just going to move ahead here. So this is Isaiah with his passport and meeting with the Sierra Leonean president in 2008. Let me go back, actually. No, I'll go forward, that's fine. So another vignette. African Ancestry's genetic ancestry testing has also played a role in efforts to obtain reparations for chattel slavery in the US. From the 40 acres and a mule promised to emancipated Blacks after the Civil War to contemporary slavery reparations social movements, US history is punctuated with instances in which formerly enslaved men and women, and later their descendants, demanded remuneration for slaves' unpaid forced labor. Brooklyn-born African-American activist Deidre Farmer Pailman was well aware of these fits and starts towards the goal of reparations when she decided to take another tact, moving from legislation and lobbying to litigation. Founder and executive director of the Reparations Study Group, a New York-based nonprofit self-described as a, quote, organization that examines approaches to securing restitution for injuries inflicted upon oppressed people, close quote. Farmer Paleman is an advocate long dedicated to the cause of seeking restitution for slavery. Her interest in the politics of the past emerged in the early 1990s when she became involved in the foment surrounding the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan in the years following her graduation in 1998 from Brooklyn College. And in particular, she was one of these cultural activists. This is from the African Burial Ground Memorial. She's not pictured here, but she was one of the cultural activists at the site. She was a leader of an artistic protest, an immense assembly of people drumming, chanting, and dancing that would succeed in ceasing excavation at the site for a time. While there, she caught a sight of the grave sites, and this experience changed her forever. As she relayed to the New York Times, quote, "They looked like they were screaming. They lived, worked, and died in the city, and they never got their reparations. It moved me." Like the African Ancestry co-founder Rick Kittles, Farmer Paleman's path to root-seeking detoured through the African burial ground. From there, she enrolled at George Washington University, where she earned a master's degree in lobbying and political campaign management, and she would encounter Rick Kittles, who was also a graduate student there. In March of 2000, she received her Juris Doctor degree from the New England School of Law in 1999, and this was no happy accident. She enrolled in law school in order to study legal strategies with which she might bring a reparations suit to trial. In March of 2002, now an attorney, she became the lead plaintiff, I'll just go back to this one so you can see that's the legal briefing. She became the lead plaintiff in Farmer Paleman versus Fleet Boston, a class action suit coalesced from several individual cases in which corporations were being sued by the descendants of slaves for the return of lost wages. Farmer Paleman's attorney, Edward Fagan, who had previously successfully obtained a settlement of $2 billion from Swiss banks on behalf of Holocaust victims, filed a complaint and demand for a jury trial in a New York federal court on behalf of his client and all other persons similarly situated against Fleet Boston, Aetna, CSX, and scores of other subsidiary companies to be determined that profited from the slave trade. So the case was heard in late 2003 by the United States District Court from the Northern District of Illinois, but was discharged in January 2004 when the court granted the corporate defendant's motion requesting a dismissal. And basically the court said, make sure I included this slide, yeah. So there's two dismissals. In the January 2004 dismissal, they basically say that they don't have standing. They can't prove that they are related to slaves that lived some time ago. The Judge Charles Norgal more specifically said, the plaintiffs cannot establish a personal injury sufficient to confer standing by merely alleging some genealogical relationship to African Americans held in slavery. So the plaintiffs sought to counter the judge's assertion that they merely alleged a genealogical relationship to enslaved men and women by providing evidence of their scientific evidence of their hereditary standing. So in March 2004, Farmer Paleman and the other plaintiffs filed a narrow reparations case, and they submitted their genetic genealogy results provided free of charge by Rick Kittles and African Ancestry. And these results linked each of them to an ethnic group or a nation state on the continent of Africa. Genetic ancestry test results associated Farmer Paleman with the Mende people of Sierra Leone, another plaintiff in the group with Niger, and a third with the Gambia, among other contemporary locations. In March 2005, in a lengthy decision, Norgal again dismissed the plaintiff's second case, again primarily on the basis of standing, and effectively says genetic mapping or DNA testing alone is insufficient to provide a decisive link to homeland. So let me move ahead here because I'm running out of time. Thus, despite the established admissibility of a similar form of genetic analysis in criminal courts, DNA identification was not efficacious in this instance, and the case remains undecided pending another appeal. From this setback, one could conclude that genetic genealogy testing is of little legal value as a means of securing reparations, that it is a failed reconciliation project. However, the plaintiffs showed considerable ingenuity in putting genetic genealogy testing to unprecedented use, and in so doing, opened new terrain for the struggle for restitution for slavery and a new type of racial politics. The reparations case may be considered, in the words of legal scholar James Davey, quote, a form of quasi-public litigation, effectively raising awareness of the issues beyond the confines of the courtroom and wider social, legal, and political fora, close quote. And in this task, Farmer Paleman and her allies may have surely succeeded. So to wrap up, go ahead here. I attended the Leon Sullivan Foundation's Global African Reunion in Atlanta, Georgia in September 2010. It was here that I learned in a public reveal ceremony, standing alongside two other African American women, that I shared ancestry with the Bamileke people of Cameroon. Rick Kittles presented my results to me along with his business partner, Gina Page, and Isaiah Washington, with Isaiah Washington, the evening's MC, standing beside him. Our three reveals, we three African-American women, were the opening act. Gina Page announced the DNA results to the women on the stage with me, and they were visibly moved by the news that at long last concluded this stage of their pursuit of African ancestry. My presentation was the last one of this opening act. Paige, who like Kittles was well aware of my ongoing research on their company, turned the microphone over to her partner. I was not sure if this was because the two of them I know Kittles better or for some other reason. Waiting to hear my results, I was worried that my skepticism of the technology would be apparent to the audience and would ruin the experience of genetic revelation and African redemption they had paid to enjoy. The headliner, the reveals of the sons of Martin Luther King Jr., so this is Isaiah and Rick. It's Isaiah's passport, which I took this photograph that night. He carries his Sierra Leonean passport with him and calls them his freedom papers, and it's a kind of a dog-eared, and he carries it in his breast pocket. The headliner, the reveals of the sons of Martin Luther King Jr., pictured there, kind of half balding, and Marcus Garvey, the son of Marcus Garvey, who's a retired cardiac surgeon who lives in Long Island, would occur in this Atlanta hotel ballroom later in the evening before the same expectant crowd that included actor Rockman Dunbar, former Atlanta mayor and United Nations Ambassador Andrew Young, representatives from the administration of then Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan, numerous African expatriates, and many African Americans. I would later learn that King and Garvey had taken the test and received the results long before this evening. So that's Garvey, Julius Garvey, receiving his results from Rick. As the scion of historic race leaders, the participation of Martin Luther King III and Julius Garvey made patent the social justice and social repair motivation of reconciliation projects. Yet on this evening, there were no exultations of "up, up, you mighty race," as Marcus Garvey famously encouraged his UNIA followers. There was no overt expression of a renewed vision of equality as articulated by King in his well-known fiery "I Have a Dream" speech. The DNA test revelations played out as a 21st century legacy of the civil rights tradition as a new racial politics, although what kind of politics this was, if any, remained unclear. These reveals lacked both Garvey's organizational structure and King's prophetic egalitarianism. Indeed, the prevailing social vision on offer on this night, through a large projection of Reverend Leon Sullivan brandishing an African passport, let me go back so you can, passport that loomed over the ballroom stage, and Washington's wielding that night of his own recently acquired Sierra Leonean passport, was one of escape. The Global African Reunion encapsulated the vexed nature of reconciliation projects, which are simultaneously atavistic and futuristic. On the one hand, this event conveyed that racial reconciliation, recompense for past injustice, and diasporic reunion, the resolution of past yet persistent matters, had been reimagined as a technical issue of the highest order. These were cutting-edge solutions to old age injustices and yearnings, new tactics for new times. The pursuit of broadly construed historical and social repair that undergirds reconciliation projects has been described as a kind of politics of the past. Sociologist John Torpy, in fact, cautions us that, quote, our vital visions of the future may be extensively supplanted by a preoccupation with the past. This social excavation, Torpy argues, is a lamentable political exercise that focuses on righting the past at the expense of advancing idealistic visions of a human future. Yet what is distinguishing about reconciliation projects, such as the African Burial Ground Project that gave birth to African ancestry, is precisely their combination of historical reckoning and future orientation. This futurist bent is embodied in the genetic science and in the action to which DNA identification is put. In other words, these projects are about the use of innovative genetic technologies and genealogical aspirations for what knowledge of the past may bring both today and tomorrow. Future promise, anthropologist Mike Fortune reminds us, is, quote, an ineradicable feature of genomics, close quote, be it a supposed crystal ball about disease and offspring or a science fictional lens on the world to come. Often oriented in the past, reconciliation projects are driven by the desire to effect change in the present and shape a different future. Through its futurity, social power, and novelty, genetic science promises to open up new capabilities for political possibility rather than curtailing them by dwelling in the past. It was vividly evident as well that most sitting with me in this Atlanta ballroom shared the convention that we were living and performing an urgent, different kind of new politics. In this new time, genetic science can be friend or foe. It can exonerate or convict. It can lead the way back to Africa, as was the case with Garvey's son, or underscore the bittersweet European ancestry of many blacks in the US, as was the case with Martin Luther King III. Yet as I was poignantly congratulated by countless strangers that evening for having recovered my African ethnic identity but felt no differently, I was keenly aware of how deeply symbolic and perhaps solely symbolic this experience was. At the same time, I was very conscious of the fact that DNA holds not only the molecular building blocks of life, but also some of our highest aspirations for ourselves, our families, and our social communities. What ultimately did I, as an individual and this transnational audience, gain from these 5 public roots revelations? What might be the consequences of the genetic mediation of Black diasporic cultural politics that have historically involved social movement tactics and civil rights organizations? Clearly, the issues, controversies, and questions we pose to science about race and the unsettled past can never find resolution in the science itself. These reconciliation efforts also raise interesting and fraught contradictions. They threaten to reify race in the pursuit of repair for injury. They suggest how justice pursuits can be easily intertwined with commercial enterprises. They may substitute genetic data for the just outcomes that are sought. And indeed, they demonstrate well that facts may not, in and of themselves, secure justice. In the poem Harlem, Langston Hughes asks, "What happens to a dream deferred?" and answers, "Does it dry up or fester like a sore? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode?" The politics of race after the genome suggests a poignant struggle for recognition and acceptance, for equity and justice. The dream deferred unleashes new and fraught tactics to this end. What does the annexation of longstanding cultural aspirations and political struggles suggest about the horizon of racial reconciliation in the US? Civil rights and racial justice organizations such as the National Urban League and the Leon Sullivan Foundation, the Organization of Tribal Unity, and the Descendants of the African Burial Ground are turning to genetics to accomplish goals formerly pursued through grassroots organizing, electoral politics, and moral suasion. However, efforts to reclaim original identity, while psychically beneficial, fail to significantly address contemporary structural inequality. In the same way that scientific and therapeutic applications of DNA research may have failed to live up to expectations, this discussion of reconciliation initiatives, I think, brings the technical, institutional, and political limits of reconciliation projects into stark relief. The trajectory of each of the projects I've discussed suggests that ultimately equality, rights, and ethics are not easily tethered or readily settled with DNA evidence. Moreover, the current preoccupation with the genetic resolution of reconciliation projects may contribute to the decline of already corporatized and waning civil rights activism, to the further slide of citizen prerogatives into consumption practices, and to the transposition of justice into technique. Thank you.